Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Keep It Fictional, the podcast from the Port Moody Public Library. I am Sadie, and today I am joined by my book friends, Al, Corrine, and Virginia. Today, we are going to be taking a bit of a different tactic for our recommendations, and we're actually going to look at other podcasts and other podcasters and see what books they have to recommend. Now, I looked a little bit into the history of podcasts because I realized I didn't actually know that much about them. So the term podcast was first coined in February 2004 by The Guardian columnist and BBC journalist Ben Hammersley. It is a portmanteau of the word iPod and broadcast, which I had no idea that was where the pod came from. And I think that it's safe to say that in the less than 20 years that this audio format has existed in its kind of more formal sense, it has grown to exponential popularity. According to Wikipedia, as of December 2022, there are at least 2,999,008 podcasts and 152,596,784 episodes of podcasts. Now, today we are not going to give you a overview of all millions of podcasts that exist, but we are going to look at a very small portion of these millions of podcasts and bring you a selection of books that we have read because they were recommended on another podcast. So why don't we get right into it? We're going to start today with Virginia. Virginia, what podcast and what book will you be talking about today?
Well, when I used to drive more, I always put on a Book Riot podcast for the road. Book Riot is a book community that focuses on highlighting diverse and marginalized voices. It's a great website to visit if you're looking for book recommendations. They got daily blog posts on different topics, and of course, multiple podcasts for every type of reader. There are genre-based ones. They're also just general kind of book-related news. It's a really, really sort of fun site to explore if you are a book lover, which I'm sure you are. So the one that I used to listen to the most is All the Books, which is a weekly podcast that talks about new books that came out that week. So it helps me keep track of new things that comes out. A new episode comes out every Tuesday, just like ours. And over the years, they have had many different hosts. But I think there's one constant that probably has started since the beginning, and that is one of the editors, Liberty Hardy, whom I've mentioned before on this show. And it's not a surprise that she's the one who sort of appears every week with kind of a rotating co-host, because if there's one person that can keep up with reading like 4 or 5 books every week and talk about them, it's probably her, because she's a ferocious reader who reads more than like 600 books a year. And she reads really, really widely. So I feel like everyone can create some sort of Venn diagram with her reading. And our diagram sort of overlap with the banana pants category. In fact, I'm pretty sure I learned the word banana pants from her. That's someone who just really, really likes strange and weird books. And it's always nice to hear her talk about it on the podcast. And I'm like, hey, that's a book that I also love, because like no one ever likes the book that I like. So it was nice to have somebody who does that. But what's even more special, as I mentioned before, is that there are also like books that she makes me go read that I have never intended to read. And I always end up kind of liking them. And these are books that I've heard about that I'm like, they're not my type. I'm just going to ignore them. But then I hear her talk about it on the podcast. And if I can tell that she really, really likes it, then more often than not, that those turn out to be good picks for me also. And it has to be the ones that she really, really, really likes. And you can tell, because I'm sure you can tell when we talk about books. when there are ones that we're like, they're good enough that we'll attach our names to it, but like, you can tell that we're like, yeah, it's okay. And then there are the ones that like we really, really love that, just we're like incoherent when we're talking about it because we love them so much. So when I can hear that, those are the ones that I will add to my to be read list to check out later. So for this episode, I thought I will go back to that list and find a book that she talked about that I have not read yet. And it is one that she like one of her top books, I think, in 2018. It's a book that I've never heard about before the podcast. So I interlibrary loaned it a few months ago, and then I ended up buying a copy for myself because I just love it so much, and I forgot to bring it, but it is the Parking Lot Attendant, and it is by Nafkote Tamirat. And this book starts with kind of like a Virginia kind of book premise. It starts with our unnamed narrator, a teenager, and her father moving to a small remote island. And this island smells of ginger all the time for some reason. And there lives a very close-knit community. And the council, whoever they are, have not quite decided yet whether they're going to allow these two newcomers to join them and stay there permanently. But in the meantime, yeah, they can stay as long as they follow all the rules. And there are so many things that you can and cannot do. And everyone follow this very kind of monotonous kind of routine, and no one seems to mind because they know that this is just a temporary home. While they are here, a permanent home for them is being created somewhere in Africa where they all originally came from. And this place is going to be glorious. They're going to enjoy so much freedom, and it's going to be a great place to live. And so they all think that whatever sacrifices they're making by following these rules and restrictions, they're all worth it because somehow, even though they don't know why, but somehow they're going to pay off. And what ultimately convinces the people that lives on the island to let our unnamed narrator and her father stay is when the father mentions the name of a person, Ayale. Now that's the setup of the book, and it seems like okay, then we're now going to gradually find out like what is the deal with the island, and it must be a very small community keeping all sorts of weird secrets, and that's kind of what I thought the book would go, but no, because the author does this repeatedly in the book, and he's like she likes to take the book to places that you don't expect. So after that short introduction, we leave the island and we go to Boston, where it all begins. Our unnamed narrator is a teenager. She goes to high school. Her family came from Ethiopia, and she used to live with her mother until she was about 6. And then her father appeared for the first time, and then her mother disappeared. So she now lives with her father and in a home that they share together, but they don't really talk about her mother. This kind of like you can feel this is a strained kind of relationship, between the two. At school, she doesn't really have anybody. She's by herself most of the time. So maybe that's why one day on her way home, when she hears a group speaking Amharic, a language that's familiar to her, she's drawn to them, specifically to this seemingly maybe a leader of the group, a late 40s, early 50s man, our title character, the parking lot attendant named Ayale. And these people who surround him seems to hang on to his every single word. And Ayale, for whatever reason, has also taken an interest in our unnamed narrator. He even knows her father, which is very strange because she thinks that like her family is so isolated, they don't talk to anyone. How does he know about her father? But he does. And he let her hang out where he works, which is the parking lot. So every day after school, she'll go do her homework in his parking lot booth. And Ayale is very invested in her education. He'll ask her every day what she learns in school. They will talk history, politics, philosophy, and of course, he will tell her all sorts of stories about the people that live in the Ethiopian community. And he seems like he just knows everybody there. And our name narrator starts to grow more and more obsessed with the parking lot and more obsessed with Ayale. Maybe she sees him as a father figure, a mentor that she never has. Maybe Finally, someone is giving her attention that she craves, that she has never got. And nothing untoward is going to happen between these two. That's not where the relationship is go. But she becomes one of kind of his disciples. And the other thing that interests her is that she knows that the parking lot is not just a parking lot. Yeah, cars come and go, people come and pay to park the cars there, but there's something else going on, and she's just not quite sure what it is. And people keep coming, and they seem to be doing what Ayala is telling them to do, but what exactly are they doing? And she feels that she still hasn't quite gained access to his inner circle, and she wants in. Well, after a few months, spending all that time in the parking lot booth, finally Ayale asks her to do something for him. He asked her to deliver a package. And when she asked him what's in the package, she said, "Oh, well, nothing special. It's just that because I know everybody in the community, and sometimes these parcels from home get lost. So I'm just making sure that they get back to the right people. That's all." But of course, our name narrator that knows that there's something else. This is something different. And she thinks that if she can deliver this package, maybe she'll find out more about what actually happens and goes on at the parking lot. Now, as I mentioned before, I bought a copy of this book because I just feel the need to own it. This is like something I really, I'm obsessed with the book. And to be completely honest, as I'm preparing my notes for today, I was like, why is this book so mesmerizing? And I don't really know if I can articulate it properly. Because, you can look at it as like maybe a coming of age story, which it is, a story of a migrant immigrant experience. Both of these, like when you're trying to find a place where you belong, you're trying to establish your identity again in a new place or in a new phase of your life. So there's definitely that. But I think what attracts me the most, of course, is the intrigue of the story, right? The mystery surrounding Ayale, around this parking lot, around this island. And you don't really know for sure what happened by the end of the book. And I think that's what I like, but I know that for some readers who want like a definitive like conclusion and would want to know like what is going on, this book may not be for you, but I love it. I love that ambiguity of it. It also goes where, as I mentioned, places where you didn't think the story is going to go. And it's not like plot twists or anything like that, but it's just like it just takes it to really interesting places. And of course, the best thing about the book is the voice of our unnamed narrator and that biting commentary that comes through her. And the words just stab right into the heart of things. And they're often quite funny, but they are so to the point. And and this relationship that she has with her father, with Ayale, is told through words that are kind of like it's not said, but you can just feel the tension in these relationships. It's a really, like I said, interesting, intriguing read. And I don't really know what it is, but I am obsessed about this book. So if you're looking for a unique read, I would highly recommend you to check out The Parking Lot Attendant by Nafkote Tamirat. And I want to say thank you again to all the different Book Riot podcasts. And I look forward to Liberty Hardy proving me wrong over and over again that I do like those books that I have dismissed.
Thank you so much, Virginia. It definitely sounds like a really interesting book, but I don't know if I could handle not knowing what happens at the end. I think I'm one of those people that I need things to be wrapped up at least in like a little bit. But that's really great. Thank you so much. All right, we are going to go to Al next. Al, what podcast and what book will you be talking about today?
So when it comes to podcasts, most of what I listen to are narrative podcasts or actual plays. So there's not a lot of book recommendations going on. So I actually had to do a little work to find a podcast that would give me a book recommendation. The only book podcast I regularly listen to aside from ours is one that kind of dunks on books. It's called If Books Could Kill, and I didn't want to pick a book that I would probably dislike. So I went and I did some searching and I found out that from the New York Times, there's the Ezra Klein podcast. And on this show, every episode, there are book recommendations. So I went through and I found an episode that I thought looked interesting. And luckily enough, one of the book recommendations really caught my eye. So the book I've chosen today comes recommended from the July 18th episode of the Ezra Klein Show, recommended by Jerusalem Demsas. It's a science fiction doorstopper that I've actually had my eye on for a while, so it worked out. So today I'm going to be talking about the Arthur C. Clarke Award winner, Children of Time by Adrian Tchaikovsky. Our story opens with Dr. Avrana Kern getting ready to address her scientific team. They've been sent out from Earth to a distant planet, carefully terraformed to mimic Earth as closely as possible, to conduct an experiment. Earth has developed a smart nanovirus that can accelerate evolution, and they have come to this planet with a sample of the nanovirus and a cargo of monkeys on which to test it. It's just about time to begin the experiment, and Dr. Kern already fancies herself something of a god to the new species she is keen to invent, excited to grant them the gift of intelligence. But of course, things don't go as planned. A member of an opposing faction on Earth known as non-ultra naturalis, or none above nature, has managed to insinuate themselves aboard the ship. And while Dr. Kern was obsessively preparing for her experiment, he's gotten ready to sabotage everything, on a suicide mission to blow up what he sees as a hubristic attempt at playing God. Dr. Kern attempts to salvage the experiment, but due to the sabotage, her monkeys burn up an atmosphere, and her ship is destroyed. She manages to escape to the sentry pod, which was meant to put a single observer into stasis until the monkeys below achieved enough intelligence to signal back, and puts herself under the care of the AI Eliza as she sends a distress message back to Earth, and settles into cryosleep to wait the at least 40 years it will take for someone to arrive and save her and get ready to start the experiment over again. Instead, 14 years later, she is awoken when news comes that an electronic virus has wiped out every device in the known galaxy, and all transmissions from Earth have gone silent following news of a war. Dr. Kern, despairing, goes back into stasis, telling the pod to wake her when it feels it's worth it. Meanwhile, down on the terraformed planet, while the monkeys were destroyed, the nanovirus has made it. It infects a spider, who we'll call Portia, and the long march of evolution begins with her eggs. 2,000 years later, on a generation ship that was barely created from the scraps of knowledge left from an earlier human era, survivors of Earth hurtle through space towards what they hope is a new home. Holston Mason, a classicist, is awakened from cryosleep by an engineer named Isa Lane because they have intercepted a signal that needs translating. Holston manages to figure out that it's a distress signal and suggests that they head towards it, while, as there are unlikely to be any people left, there might be technology there they can use. The commander of the ship, Free Guyen, is thrilled. 2 years later, Holston is awoken again as they have arrived and see the terraformed planet below as their salvation. The sentry pod, however, and the partially uploaded brain of Dr. Kern see the approaching humans as a threat to what is left of her experiment, and she threatens them to leave before she destroys them. Back on the planet, a new generation of spiders are traveling in search of information. The spiders have evolved to be larger and more intelligent by this time, and have the ability to transmit knowledge across generations by a process known as understanding. The spiders find out there's a colony of ants, which unbeknownst to them have also been enhanced by the nanovirus, though not with the same kind of intelligence. The colony is threatening the safety of spider kind nearby, and may even come to threaten the larger settlement of spiders on the coast from which this group has come. The rest of this novel continues to go back and forth between the various generations of the spiders and the remaining humans, following as the spiders grow more and more intelligent and develop their civilization, while the human society aboard the generation ship Gilgamesh begins to devolve as they try and fail to find somewhere to land. Their only hope seems to be the spiders' planet, but the double threat of Dr. Kern and the intelligent spiders may prove to be insurmountable. This is a harder science fiction novel than I tend to go for, in the sense that it's more interested in technology, the ramifications of technology, how species evolve, than it is the more sort of exploring the more interpersonal elements, though there is definitely explorations of character in this novel as well. The story is epic in scope, taking place over thousands of years and many generations. And though we have some consistency of characters on the human side of things due to the technological intervention of the cryogenic stasis, we don't have that for the spiders, but the author chooses to continue the same names over and over, so there's a thematic through line. We see generation after generation of Portias, Biancas, Violas, and Fabians, each different, but occupying a similar role in their portion of the story. The novel is really ambitious in its scope, and I think it manages to pull off what it's trying to do pretty well. I enjoyed reading it, and I found myself more invested in the world building of the Spider Society and its characters than the human portions. Despite being a big book, it moves at a quick pace with short chapters that easily tempt you just to read just one more. If you're interested in picking up a bit of a brick of a story that's full to the brim with the ideas, then this might be for you. If you're a fan of classic science fiction or just interested in world building, then Children of Time by Adrian Tchaikovsky might be for you. I will say it's definitely not for the arachnophobes, though.
Thank you, Al. I was just going to say, I don't think that I could do it. I don't think so. I have been working on my fear of spiders. It is not quite as bad as it was before, but no, I don't think I could do intelligent spiders who could. Yeah, no.
Intelligent half-meter long spiders.
No, definitely not. Definitely not.
I was just about to ask how much did it describe the spiders? But like, no, I don't think I need to know. Thank you. That's for next week's episode. That's for next week's episode.
Next week.
It's like the giant, I cannot remember the name of the artist, like the giant spider statues that one artist makes. Sorry, okay. I'm going to stop talking because Virginia is about to have a meltdown. So
on that note, why don't we switch over to our existential question for today, which may or may not have anything to do with spiders. We will have to see. So the question that I am posing to my book friends is, if you had to recommend any podcast other than Keep It Fictional that you think every person should listen to, what would it be? Oh, I'm getting some blank stares. Oh no.
see, you made it a little bit trickier because you're like, oh, I think when we were talking about it, like, oh, what podcast would you recommend? Oh, I could do that. But like the podcasts that I listen to, I know are not for everyone. And so I wouldn't recommend them for everyone. Because kind of, as we know, I listen to a lot of true crime, especially a lot of true crime podcasts. And I recognize that that is not a genre for everyone. In fact, it's a genre for very few. So I'm going to kind of like take your question and kind of like shift it a little bit to everyone who is a true crime fan of what podcast I would recommend to them. I was going to be a little bit braggy in that actually I think one of the best podcasts is a French podcast, which has all like the vibes of unsolved mysteries and very few libel laws, which is Le Coin du Crime, which is very good. But the podcast that I'm actually going to recommend, which is kind of fairly new, but I think so thoughtful and well put together and well researched, and that I think is has a really good concept and executes it really well, is Buried Bones, which is a podcast by Paul Holes, who is probably he is a cold case investigator and is probably most famous for working on the Golden State Killer podcast and helping to solve that, with Kate Winkler Dawson, who is a journalist, a professor, and a producer. And so she has also written a couple of really, really well-researched books. So she really kind of knows the history of it. And what they do is they delve into cold cases, as they say on the podcast, some of them very cold from like the 1800s and the 1900s. Kate kind of lays out the case, and then Paul Holes kind of weighs in using modern forensic techniques to kind of maybe shed some light on how these cases could have actually been solved now, or kind of give some answers. So it's a really neat combination of like knowing the history of something. So Kate really gives a wonderful overview of like the history and the time period. And then also kind of learning about how investigation would be done on kind of like the forensic side of things. So it's a very interesting podcast. I like that the cases are quite old. And because Kate Winslow Dawson is an author and a journalist, they're very, very well researched, and they just approach them wonderfully. So yeah, it's Buried Bones. You can catch up very easily, but it's very informative, very interesting, and very well done.
That sounds really, really interesting. And I'm absolutely fascinated by true crime. I'm just also terrified by true crime. And so I feel like I would really want to listen to something like that. But when it's like created with the atmospheric music and that kind of stuff, I can't do it. I can't do it.
Yeah. As I mentioned, I listen to a lot of narrative and actual play podcasts, and I think, again, it's not going to be for everyone. The one that I would recommend very highly is an actual play podcast called Friends at the Table. It is it's about good friends and smart world building and just having a really good time. And they really, if you're interested in tabletop gaming, if you're interested in the mechanics of systems, they really go deep into the mechanics, and like they play it really well. They really pay attention to the narrative of the stories they're crafting and zoom out a bit to sort of say, okay, from a narrative level, this is the kind of thing I want to do. They're obviously, as the title suggests, really good friends. They're having a good time. And some of the stories they craft are just absolutely amazing. They do multiple different seasons, some of which are interconnected. I highly recommend starting with either Marielda, which is a very short season that they did as sort of an intermission between their Chiron seasons, which are a fantasy kind of world that they play in Dungeon World, which is the Powered by the Apocalypse version of D&D, basically. And that one is just a really smart, really fun, really well-crafted short story that they tell. Or my personal favorite season, Counterweight, which is a science fiction season set in a world with lots of giant mechs, and the gang gets to fight capitalism. It's a lot of fun, and you will have a lot of emotions. That much I can guarantee. So yes, if I'm going to be recommending a podcast to people, I will probably recommend Friends at the Table. Check it out on your podcatcher of choice.
I don't really listen to them anymore. I'm trying to learn to be an audiobook person like Fiona does. And because I don't drive, right? So like it's like there's only very few times I could do it. I'm like, maybe I'll try an audiobook. So I'm learning to do more of that. I think when my husband and I are in the car, if we ever do listen to it, it's usually some hockey podcasts because hockey. I mean, just like all of us, right? We're based on our subject. So, like that would be what I listen to. But because it's a book podcast, I'm just gonna say, and this is like a weird thing to recommend because I've only listened to one episode of this podcast. But it is called Between the Covers. And I look for it. It's a Tin House podcast. And it is with a host called David Nyman. And I only listened, like I said, only listened to one episode because of the author that they were interviewing. And I'm not going to reveal who it is because I'm going to save it for later. But I was very, very impressed with how this interviewer interviews. Like I learned so much from how you talk to authors, because I think sometimes when you listen to book podcasts, like they don't let the authors talk. They just keep telling them what they think, and then it takes over, right? Whereas I feel like this David Nyman is so good at being able to pull out and get the authors to be the center and really like focus on them, but asking really, really intelligent questions. So I was just like very, very impressed with that. So yeah, but otherwise it's really just hockey podcasts. So
I mean, that's fair. That's fair. I am also not a huge podcast listener, which is weird that I picked this topic for this episode. Which I'll go into when I talk about my book a little bit. But one podcast that I did listen to was actually right at the beginning of the pandemic. It came out, and it was put out by the same people who created Tanis, Rabbits, and the Black Tapes, none of which I have listened to. because they are not my kind of genre. The Black Tapes, my husband's going to kill me for saying this, but the Black Tapes was the podcast that he listened to the summer that I was living in the Kootenays, and caused him to have to sleep with the lights on every single night, because he was so creeped out. And he can deal with horror stuff. He can deal with creepy stuff. But that one he just said was too much. So I've avoided all of their other podcasts. But this one was recommended by my husband Tyler, and it's called Fairy, and it's only one season. I have hoped that they've been putting out a second season, because it ended after 12 episodes on a cliffhanger. And I've been waiting and waiting and waiting now for over 3 years, and it has not come out with another season, which according to Tyler, that is sort of the way that they put out their podcasts. Many of them wait very long periods of time without more episodes. But yeah, it is about, it's a fictional podcast about a young woman who saves a man's life. And she kind of, because of that day, she starts an investigation into what actually happened that day, and why she, kind of why this man was in danger, and why she had to save his life. And it opens her up into a world of ancient mythological creatures and fairies, and not the cute kind of fairies, the dark fae and the dark fairy type, and kind of conspiracy theories and things like that. So it is a very atmospheric. It is, I used to listen to it. I would try to get out every day, especially at the beginning of the pandemic, and just go for walks on the seawall. And so that would be my seawall listening during that time. So I would highly recommend Fairy. It's by, oh my goodness, I'm not going to remember who put this out. Oh geez, I can't remember. I will try and find it. But yes, it's from the same creators as Tanis Rabbits and the Black Tapes. All right. Well, thank you for recommending more podcasts to our listeners today. We're going to get back into our books, and we're going to go to Corrine. What other podcast and what book are you going to be talking about?
Yes. So it's a true crime podcast. Obviously, it's very interesting listening to everyone and kind of like what they listen to, because like I can't stand narrative. I can't stand narrative. But I did like the first season of The Adventure Zone. That I really enjoyed. But usually I listen to something that's like very one episode, one story. And I think that's just because for people who commute, you like something that you can put on at the start of your commute and then get the whole thing by the end. And one that's just about the perfect length if you kind of skip through a couple of things. That was one of the first true crime podcasts that I really like. And I think it was one of the first true crime podcasts that many people listened to for the very first time, which is kind of like the granddaddy of all true crime podcasts, which is My Favorite Murder. So this is a true crime comedy podcast. And if those words kind of make you shake your head, then it's absolutely not for you. And I totally understand. The first episode dropped in 2016. So it has been around for a long time. It features two friends, Karen Kilgariff and Georgia Hardstark, each of who take turns telling stories of true crime, survival, weird and spooky events, and often frankly discuss issues kind of about mental health, which I think is kind of quite wonderful of them. They have, oh gosh, like a cajillion episodes. I can't even look at it. So if you're looking to kind of like start into this, I would recommend kind of starting in the middle of the episodes where they kind of got researchers. Because if you go back to the very beginning, it's very much off the cuff. If you remember kind of watching a documentary at one time and you're recounting it back to your friend and you're remembering things poorly, that is kind of like the vibe of the first couple of episodes. But kind of as they grew and kind of realized, that they had an audience for it, they made more attempts to be more accurate. In fact, they have a corrections corner on every episode where they go back and recap all the things that they got wrong that people gently pointed out to them. So I chose a book that was recommended by Georgia Hardstark on the podcast. As Virginia knows, I do not like to take recommendations from people. But I decided to try this one to varying degrees of success. So this is a fiction book, but I can definitely see where it's based on. And 20 years ago, a teary-eyed teenager named Dennis Danson protested his innocence in the horrible murders of a young Holly Michaels. This took place in Red River County in Florida. At the time, he was 18 years old. And despite the fact that it was only circumstantial evidence, that he protested that there was another person, the short man, at the scene, that the police ignored, and that they seemed to be absolutely focused on this young man, he was convicted and sentenced to death. Now, that was 20 years ago. And for 20 years ago, Dennis has been locked away. However, recently online, a group of citizen detectives have taken up his cause of innocence. They are championing the re-examination of Dennis's case based on the fact that it seems like there has been something that was missed. And one of these people online whose heartstrings are pulled by Dennis's story of innocence is 31-year-old Samantha. She is recovering from a very, very bad breakup. She is a school teacher who feels kind of alone and adrift in her life. She feels like no one really understands her. And so when online she delves deeper and deeper into Dennis's story, she feels outraged and connected with the fact that this young man has suffered so much. And so she decides to write him a letter. And what is surprising is that he writes back. They start a correspondence. Dennis feels like Sam really understands him as a person. Beyond what happened to him, he feels like they are connecting on a deeper level. And Sam finally has someone who really, really understands her and listens to her. Now, Dennis's case has been getting more and more media play. In fact, there is a true crime documentary that is being planned and filmed. Now, the filmmakers, knowing how important Sam is in Dennis's life right now, offer to fly her all the way from England to the States. And despite her misgivings, and definitely her father's misgivings, she decides to travel over and finally meet Dennis in person. The filmmakers believe in his innocence. She believes in his innocence. But beyond this kind of feeling of maybe empathy for his story, empathy for his life, pity, she believes that she feels something deeper for him and something a little bit more frightening. When she finally decides to meet him in jail, the connection is instant. There is an undeniable attraction between the two, and to the delight of the documentary film crew, and again, less so her family, Dennis proposes and Sam accepts. Suddenly, she is Dennis Danson's wife. And that's not the only surprise. Thanks to the media coverage and donations and attention by Hollywood elites and politicians who have kind of taken and championed Dennis's story of innocence, it is eventually brought before the courts, re-examined, and he is set free. And this is where the fairy tale life should start. It's difficult for Dennis at first. He has spent the last 20 years in jail. He needs to adjust to what has happened in television, pop culture, the fact that cell phones exist, the internet. It's a lot to adjust, but it's made easier by the fact that Sam is by his side the whole time. And as he kind of delves into the world and the film gains more traction and he does a lot of interviews, Sam feels proud and joyful and a little worried. The more time she spends with Dennis, the more questions she has about him. He has a temper, but that makes sense, of course. He was in jail for 20 years. He sometimes seems to turn on a dime with regards to his personality. He's not exactly who he shows to the media. And some strange friends from his previous life back in Florida start to make their way into his life again, and they make Sam uncomfortable. Over time, with a lot of free time on her hands, Sam just starts to wonder. She loves him, of course. She trusts him. He's her husband. And he's innocent. I mean, his case was brought before the courts again, and he was proclaimed innocent. Right? This thriller by Amy Lloyd was the winner of the Daily Mail First Novel Competition. It is blurbed by Lee Child, so clearly has some traction. And it's definitely just like a classic old thriller of did he or didn't he, which I am going to confidently point a finger that I think that it's kind of based on Ted Bundy's wife that he married while he was in jail. It's tough. It's tough because at its core is a main character whose life choices I do not agree with in any way. And so it's really it's a tough read because you think she's an idiot. And so it's really I can see why someone would recommend this, and when this is kind of like when it came out, it was kind of all over kind of different book bloggers and stuff like that as a really good thriller. And it is a very good thriller because at its core, is this really good mystery of like, well, did he do it or didn't he do it? And you have a narrator who you don't completely trust because again, she makes terrible life decisions. And so it is a very compulsive read. I think you can enjoyably sit down and do it in one setting. Is it a satisfying read for me? No. But if you're just looking to like turn your brain off for like 2.5 hours and just kind of enjoy like trying to suss out whether he's guilty or whether he's not guilty, and then again trying not to say Ted Danson instead of Dennis Danson, and then kind of like laughing to yourself the entire time, it's very enjoyable in that way. Like I think it sets out to like do something, and by gum does it do it. It's exactly what it says on the tin. It's just like a light, like domestic thriller in some ways. So, and again, like it won the Daily Mail competition. So I think she kind of knows what she's doing in terms of a first novel. Will I ever take recommendations again? No. We're done with that. But I appreciated this kind of delve into a light thriller. So that is where I will end.
Thank you, Corinne. Yes, I struggle reading books and reading characters who just repeatedly make choices that you just keep asking why, and why.
It is tough because like fundamentally your main character is someone who writes to, a convicted murderer in jail and then decides to marry him for first week. So it's really, yeah, it's the same thing. It's really tough to get behind them and kind of cheer for them as a protagonist when you're just like, really, ma'am, you have no one in your life who's telling you that this is a really stupid idea other than her father, who's like, Sam, why? But he's all the way in England, so no one can help her. It's tough.
Well, thank you for bringing that mixed review of The Innocent Wife. All right. So as I mentioned, it is a little bit funny that I picked this topic because I don't really listen to a lot of podcasts. Now, before when I would transit everywhere, I usually drive now, but when I would transit everywhere, I would actually try and listen to podcasts. I had a few that I would listen to, and I would find that about halfway through my commute, I would realize I had not heard a single thing that the podcast had said because I would just zone out. I would zone out. I was on the SkyTrain. I would be staring out the window and I wouldn't listen. It was the same reason why I didn't listen to audiobooks for a really long time, because same thing. I would zone out and I wouldn't have any idea what was happening. Now, I have moved beyond that a little bit. I find, weirdly enough, that driving helps me to pay attention to what I'm listening to. I think that it requires enough focus on other things that I'm able to kind of continue listening. I know that makes no sense, but it's in a weird way it works for me. But similar to Virginia, I have been trying to listen to more audiobooks, and I've been needing to listen to more audiobooks in order to read all of the books that I need to read right now. So again, not a lot of time for podcasts. However, there is one podcast that for a very, very long time I would listen to pretty religiously. I started listening to it after it had been released. So it's another one, Corinne, that was released in 2016. So it has also been around for quite a while. And they have increased. They started, I think, at one episode every 2 weeks. Now they're at an episode every week. Creators have also been quite successful. They've created their own podcasting corporation, you might say. So their company, Multitudes, has, I believe, 8 podcasts that now run under the title of a Multitude podcast. And the podcast, it just so happens that they recommend books every episode, but they also have guest hosts on the podcast that some of them are writers and some of them recommend their own books. And so that is one of the books that I have decided to talk about today. It was a book that I've been wanting to read for quite a while based on listening to this podcast. And so this episode gave me an opportunity to finally listen to it. So that is why I picked this episode, even as someone who does not really listen to podcasts. Anyways, the podcast that I will be talking about is called Spirits. Now, it describes itself as a boozy podcast about mythology, legends, and folklore. The boozy side of things I don't usually pay attention to. Every episode, the hosts will make a drink or give a recipe for a drink that kind of goes along with the theme of the episode that they are talking to. The hosts are Julia Schaffini and Amanda McLaughlin. And along with one of their co-creators, Eric Schneider, he'll sometimes pop in as a co-host as well. They talk about legends. They talk about myths. They talk about folklore. And they don't only talk about these legends in the historical sense, but they use these legends and they use their platform to hear and to tell stories in a way, as they describe, that centers the voices of the currently and historically oppressed, with an active mission to dismantle colonialist, white supremacist, and heteropatriarchal ideologies. So they have a huge lineup of guest hosts who specialize in different topics and different mythologies. This podcast really fed into my love of ancient mythology and ancient folklore, but it also introduced me to so many other stories and cultures and mythologies that I had not previously been introduced to. These include the Japanese folktale of the crane wife, the mythology of the Urzulis in Haitian voodoo, and the Mexican legend of La Lechuza, who is a witch who can shapeshift into a giant owl to enact her revenge on the townspeople who murdered her. Kind of kick-ass. So the book that I am going to be talking about was written by one of the guest hosts on the podcast, Jess Zimmerman. Zimmerman is the editor-in-chief of Electric Literature, and her essays and fiction and opinion pieces and prose poetry have appeared in many other publications, including The Cut, Washington Post, The Guardian, and The New Republic. Zimmerman has actually appeared on the show twice. First, she came on to talk about the Greek legend of Circe in episode 44. And then her second appearance was to do a deep dive into the Greek myths, and specifically the way that women are portrayed in these myths. So this is episode 222, and it shares the name with her book, Women and Other Monsters. So this book takes a similar dive into that world of mythology and the women who are included in it, and more specifically, how they are included in it. More than that, Zimmerman uses the myths and the legends of Greek mythology to look at the way that women have in the past and continue to be treated by society. She focuses on how, for example, showing anger, showing excessive hunger, showing ugliness or ambition can in one instance make a man seem heroic and a woman seem monstrous. So in the end of the book, it kind of aims to not just educate people about these mythological creatures and their stories, but also to tear apart the idea that being monstrous is actually and automatically a bad thing. The book notes that the monsters actually get to do a lot more than what other female characters get to do in these stories. They get more freedom. They get to be larger than life in a way that women are very rarely allowed to be. They get to be their complete monstrous selves, and they sometimes get to kick a lot of ass. So the book focuses on 11 female monsters from Greek mythology. I won't mention all of them, but it includes Medusa and the Gorgons, the Enchantress Circe, the sea serpent Scylla, the Sirens, the Furies, the Chimera, among others. For each of the monsters, Zimmerman goes into the original myth. She'll often cite multiple versions of the story, depending on kind of who wrote about them over time. She explains where there may be differences within these versions, where the translations have changed, where kind of the tellings of the stories are slightly different, and why that might be. And then she looks into some of the reasons why, more by historical accounts, these creatures and these women would have been looked at as monsters. What kind of characteristics they may have had that society viewed as monstrous, either at that time or still today. And then from there, she looks at the present day. So she brings things in from the present day. She talks about how these same characteristics are still being used to undermine women by turning them into these monstrous creatures and these monstrous images. She uses a lot of pop culture references to make her point and demonstrate kind of the instances that these myths and ideas are still very much prevalent. For example, she starts one of her chapters on the Sirens by analyzing Aerosmith's Crazy music video. It's weird, but it makes sense. It works. It works. The book is part memoir. Zimmerman kind of intersperses stories and experiences of her own life to tie into the myths and into this idea of kind of monstrous behavior and monstrous women. She offers a very vulnerable and open look at her own life, talking about her marriage and her divorce, and kind of what she had always told herself was okay in her life, because she always felt that she didn't deserve love. She didn't deserve connection. And that was because she didn't fit this ideal view of what a woman was supposed to be. She was too big. She was too loud. She was too angry. And because of all that, she had been trained and taught to expect that she didn't deserve all these things. And because of that, she made choices in her life so that she could feel love, so that she could feel connection. She talks about her own monstrosities, which she's kind of been working on owning since she was a child. And in the end, her book acts not just as a historical analysis of the myths and the legends, but kind of a battle cry and a confirmation of the greatness that monstrosity can be. I really like this quote. It's from her introduction. It says, "What happens if we charge through the gates and find that living on the other side, in all our too muchness, oversized, overweening, and overcomplicated as we are, means living full for the first time? Then a monster story stops being a warning sign and starts to be a guide. Draw a new map. Mark, be monsters here." So as you can probably tell, I really enjoyed this book. I actually listened to this as an audiobook. It was narrated by Vanessa Moyen, and it was super, super engaging. I knew kind of going into the book from having listened to the Spirits podcast that the monsters of Greek mythology always had more going on in their stories than it kind of originally is shown in these myths, and oftentimes that these monsters were women and that they were looked at as these monstrous creatures when in fact they had these sort of quite traumatic and quite hard pasts that had led them to be created by into monsters. I think one of the most famous of these stories is Medusa, who was, I'm going to give a trigger warning about sexual assault. She was basically raped by Poseidon in Athena's temple. And to enact her revenge, Athena turns her into Medusa because she is angry that this happened on her in her temple. And so these really traumatic and these really horrible stories, and all that we see are these kind of monstrous creations that have come out of it. So I knew all of that going into it, but it was really interesting to hear more about each of the monsters and to hear kind of how she got to where she was. when we see her in the myths. I really appreciated the personal stories that were intertwined into the book, even though the topic could be quite maddening at times to talk about and to think about. I really appreciated that Zimmerman kept quite a humorous tone throughout the whole book, which really worked. So I would really highly recommend this book for anyone who is interested in Greek mythology, but also who wants to take a deeper look into it, who wants to look at it maybe with a bit of a feminist perspective, or anyone who is interested in just kind of knowing how some of the greatest monsters of myth actually came to be. So that is Women and Other Monsters: Building a New Mythology by Jess Zimmerman. All right. Well, thank you so much to all of my book friends for bringing not just book recommendations today, but also podcast recommendations. I think that as part of the community of the millions of podcasts that are out there, it is nice sometimes to recognize what other content is being created in this medium, and to promote those a little bit. So hopefully you will go out and find some new podcasts on whatever platform you use to get podcasts. I think they are all available on many different platforms. So go forth, listen, read, and have a wonderful time doing it. I hope you all have a good day, and we will see you next time. Bye.